This podcast is sponsored by redhorizon.com. You can go to redhorizon.com now and sign up for a free hosted Urbit planet and use it to explore the Urbit network. You can also use Red Horizon Fleets if you're a developer and create your own Urbit products. That's redhorizon.com.
Welcome to the inaugural episode of Urbit Radio. Here today with master-malwyl, also joined by tiller-tolbus, your two hosts.
Pleasure to be here.
We don't have much of any kind of structure to this, what it is we're doing here today. We're just going to freestyle it. We have like 4 bullet points, and we're just going to allow the magic to emerge is kind of the loose plan today.
Whatever latent magic is stored within our bullet points will emerge through the course of this conversation.
Yes. So let's jump into one.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wanted to talk about a couple of things on this show. And I guess one reason that I wanted to do Urbit Radio is that I have a lot of good conversations with a lot of people in the Urbit community, master-malwyl especially. And, I ran this podcast for a while, the Red Horizon podcast, which was really just a kind of normal, I would say, baseline interview format where we spoke to interesting personalities in the Urbit community and asked them questions and tried to get them to talk about their experiences, their opinions, try to bring, some personality out of the interesting people of the community. And my opinion is we made some pretty good episodes, but in the end, I would say that the conversations we had in that format were a lot less interesting than the conversations that I just have personally with people in a kind of unstructured format. And so I wanted to be able to riff, and we're going to try to do a podcast format or a radio show format that's more appropriate to riffing. In addition to that, I also have opinions, and being somebody who interviews somebody else, can make it seem inappropriate for me to interject my own opinions. So yeah, we're going to try to do something new here. We're going to try to just have a talk radio style Urbit podcast and talk about current events, things going on Urbit, things that have always been going on Urbit. And yeah, ideally just bring to light, the interesting topics that I have discussed with people in the Urbit community to a broader audience.
Yeah, that's true for me too. I mean, I've never hosted a podcast, but there have been many occasions where I wish there was, some kind of recording in process, because I'm sure many people within the Urbit community have had many very stimulating conversations, and let's capture some of these and share the good ones.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning one reason why I think a lot of the interesting things that get talked about within the Urbit community don't get published to broader audiences is because despite being an open source project that very clearly builds in public, where, the people who are most close to the core, people who are closest to the core of, the Urbit program itself are very eager to share exactly what it is that they're doing with the world. Yet within the broader ecosystem, there are just an odd number of things that are hidden behind some kind of non-disclosure agreement, things that have happened that the people involved would rather just not be public knowledge until a later date. And that's not something we're going to try to exactly address on this podcast. We're not going to try to spill everybody's dirty laundry. But I think that's just an interesting tidbit about, the place that we're in the Urbit community is that for whatever reason, and I don't exactly know how I would diagnose this, but despite being like this young upstart community that is really centered around a project with great ideals in terms of transparency and publicizing things and working together, there happens to be, I don't know how I would describe it. There's a habit, I guess, of trying to keep things under the hood. And sometimes it's just because people, don't want to advertise something they haven't delivered yet, right? But other times it's, in my opinion, trying to seek a competitive advantage that maybe some people and organizations already have, and that they could simply just tell everybody exactly what their plans are and nobody would be capable of overtaking them in the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've experienced this personally. Some people listening might know this, but last year, 2023, the main focus of my productive effort was developing a hosting platform. And I was pretty quiet about it. I think less than 5 people really I shared it with or gave some kind of demo. And yeah, I did have that kind of mentality of like, okay, I think I've figured out a few tricks here that might give me some kind of competitive edge. And yeah, like I personally am a bit of a competitive person, so I wanted to keep those close to my chest, or some of them anyway. Yeah, so there's a bit of that. I think also, could it just be that there's a fair amount of effort that goes into communication? I mean, recording, it doesn't have to be a podcast necessarily, but just sharing what's going on, what you're doing. Yeah, I think that could be part of it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is also just kind of hard to explain some of the things that are happening. I mean, hopefully we do a good job of that here. There's also the aspect of, you don't really want some user of your platform or some fan of what you're doing to come in and assume the privilege of being able to interject their design opinions. That's a very common problem that plagues open source projects, is that every user feels that they are entitled to a personal audience to the developers, and that because they are making the sacrifice of using an open source program, that they therefore have the right to dictate exactly how it should work, and that their opinion should be treated as gold. And obviously you want to avoid some degree of that. But yeah, what could we do on this radio show? We could take the information that's in the air, and especially the information that you and I are privy to that is not secret, but that is not being talked about, podcasted about, blogged about. Nobody's made content regarding this stuff, and it's interesting, and it's not secret. And we can hopefully get people a little excited about it. So this program is not targeted towards people who are completely new to Urbit. Not that we have any problem with that audience listening to this program, but we're not going to dedicate excessive effort towards breaking down all of the jargon and introducing all of the characters as they get brought up. If we use a term like knock or hoon or Kelvin versioning, we are not going to stop the show and explain what that is. You, of course, are free to pause the show and look it up. docs.urbit.org, Command K on Mac, Control K on Windows or Linux. It's going to be a great tool. A great tool to help you along. But the target audience here is people who are on Urbit, ideally people who like Urbit or who know what it's about, and they want to see what's going on. And you and I, Ryan, are pretty close to the wire on some of this stuff. So I think we're in a pretty good position to broadcast some of the things that are going on.
Yes, absolutely. There have been many times over the past few years where if I had just been in this habit, if we had been in this habit of just clicking the record button, I think that would have been. Why is that funny?
Well, I mean, we just went through like a half hour of preparation for hitting the record button. So sometimes hitting the record button is not so easy. And yeah, I mean, you can obviously reach a greater number of people as well by making the content as palatable as possible. We're doing an audio focused show for now. Video was brought up. We're going to try to, and please give us feedback, audience, on how well we did. But we're going to try to release excellent quality audio. That's the primary goal of this program. So the thing that's been on my mind this last couple of weeks is user space primitives. And going back to, because I haven't been on Urbit very long. I started getting involved late in 2021, and I wasn't really involved to a serious degree until early 2022. And at the time in early 2022, when I was first catching my stride, learning about the system, and starting to accomplish a deep understanding of where the value was, in the Urbit project, the narrative that was capturing people's hearts and minds had to do with this buzzword of composability. And I think now, in the aftermath of everything that's happened since 2022, we've reached a point where composability means different things actually now to different people. And it's even maybe aged as a buzzword to the point where some people will dismiss the word itself as meaning anything of tangible value. And I actually share that cynicism. I think there are other words that could be used that are more particular, and maybe we can, delve into some of the things that composability can mean. Probably the first one that comes to mind is interoperability. So the composability thesis had a lot to do with the fact that the human mind, or maybe you would just say minds in general, if you want to take a post-human perspective, they don't really like to switch contexts. They like to be able to stay focused in the same frame, and ideally, when working on a problem or doing something, never really leave the room and forget about where they were before, have to hold something in the back of the head as they do something else. This was applied to the blockchain context, where Uqbar, who was a company that was building a blockchain on Urbit at the time, believed that the secret power that Urbit was going to give them, that would give them a competitive advantage in the blockchain world, was the ability for developers to not have to switch contexts between the idea of local state, representing ordinary applications from, before and after the invention of blockchains, and global state, representing smart contracts and state that is replicated on many machines in a permissionless setting. And so composability in their minds had to do with primarily just the ability to think about both of those styles of engineering within the same context window, and only having a minor difference in how a developer addresses on-chain data versus off-chain data, global state versus local state, blockchain development versus ordinary application development. But that's not all that was meant by composability. And one thing that I think was implied by this, and what was actually exemplified by some of the open source applications that Uqbar was releasing at the time of promulgating this thesis, was interoperability. And so they were showing how they could actually release a different front end for somebody else's application on Urbit much more easily than you could do the same thing for example, if you took an application like Signal, which is a project with very high ideals and does most of its work by a very open source standard. Building a novel client for Signal and putting your own front-end design style on that protocol is challenging. I don't think it's been done by a professional outfit yet. I might be wrong. Where on Urbit, the challenge is much less clear, I would say. They definitely did accomplish that. They took a social media application developed by Talon called Groups, and they developed their own application called Escape, which used and interoperated with Groups. Groups users could see and interact with messages from Escape and vice versa. And Escape even extended the features of Groups to where at the time reactions were not possible in Groups software, but they were possible on Escape. And on Escape, you could react to a message without significantly disturbing the experience of Groups users. So this had a lot to do with the kind of idea of composability. And I think if you really break down the notion of composability between all of those ways that it was used, those two primary ones that I just brought up, interoperability and the lack of the need for context switching, one could say that what composability is in the Urbit context had something to do with just the way things fit together. The idea that objects in the compute world had a greater degree of compatibility with one another than in the rest of the world. And I think that's somewhat true. But what turned out not to be true is the full extent of the interoperability part of the thesis, where I think people honestly expected that Urbit applications were so interoperable with each other by nature that two competitors could share data with one another, and that users of each program would not have any difficulty in switching between one or the other. And I think 2023 showed that that wasn't true, and that what was actually needed was common primitives, for the reason that Urbit does not take away the need for APIs. APIs can change. If you have an application with knowledge of another application, then you must take the risk of the other application changing and your application needing to change too. And this became a problem between these two parties, Uqbar and Talon. It became a fact that Uqbar did not want to call or give their application knowledge of Talon's application, even though it could. And so my thesis going forward now is, because the moral of the story, for those who were not around, is Uqbar ended up creating their own application, which was not cross-compatible, not interoperable with Talon's application. And my thesis going forward is that, yes, this compatibility property is there, this interoperability property is there, but what's required to bring it to its full fruition are common primitives in order to place data somewhere that two parties can mutually agree can be trusted to hold that data and not conflict with the incentives of each party.
Well, I'm not actually sure what I'm going to be able to add to that. That is a pretty deep, thorough analysis and history recap. Perhaps the most useful thing that I could say here is that my original view on the value proposition of composability was the recyclability, which kind of touches on what you just said about the development of primitives. Because in my mind, if someone built a chat protocol that was designed just right, just had the right amount of generalizability, then, we in practice, we have not seen this, but it could be the final chat protocol, and then no one else ever has to write another. And that would free up developers to focus on more interesting work. In practice, that does not seem to have occurred. When you talk about the development of primitives, is that what you're pointing towards?
It is. And actually, I don't know if chat maps perfectly onto this, which is unfortunate because it's also the area where composability failed the most in 2023. But let's think this over. Let's take a short break. This is a radio show with breaks and musical interludes, and so let's take our first one and come back in a couple minutes and discuss. And we're back. This session is being recorded live. When you, the audience, can hear music playing, so can we. I don't know if that adds anything. I thought it might contribute something to the vibe.
We're building a vibe together.
Just want to make sure the audience knows that these breaks do not imply that hours or days are happening in between segments of the conversation. It adds something. So, vis-a-vis composability, interoperability, I've actually taken the initiative to start working with the Red Horizon team and the Urbit Labs team together to begin to try to address this problem, where to kind of take an academic approach to the problem. What you have here are an A and a B who would like to interoperate with each other, but may or may not trust one another. They might be competitors, or they might just be mutually self-interested with no real opinion of the other, but not wanting to extend unnecessary trust to other organizations, or view themselves in some sort of privileged way where a common attitude might be where the problem of interoperability is knowledge. Who has knowledge of who? A does not want to call B, but wants to interoperate with B. So A says to B, why don't you call A? Because A is actually primary. It is the more important, the more primitive thing. But B shares A's perspective and would respond with the same statement. You, A, should call B because B is actually primary. Mutually, neither of them want to have knowledge of the other because it implies some kind of organizational risk of, do I need to support knowledge of your platform on my platform? Do I need to add this organizational complexity of keeping track of what you're doing so that I can remain compatible with you? And this is a clear case of needing common standards. And so I think the Urbit Foundation is in a great place to provide these and has shown the will to address this issue more or less along the same lines as what I've described, where what A and B both want is they do want to interoperate with each other. They don't want that to come at a cost. And so what if there was a P such that A and B can both have knowledge of the same P and interoperate with each other on that basis? And can there exist a P such that A and B do not consider it a risk to have knowledge of P? And I think the developers of such a primitive, of such a P, would need to be properly incentivized. They would also need to deliver something that is truly primitive at the API level, that is not subject to significant change, or where in such cases there are written guarantees about how interfaces may change in the future. And that is an approach that the Urbit Foundation would like to take, and that I personally have gotten involved in thinking through what it would mean to deliver such primitives. And thankfully, the Urbit ecosystem is actually not in any way stranger to that pattern. We have an open source developer who goes by PalDev, who releases primitive applications that work just like I described, that are easy to read by even new Hoon School graduates to understand how they work, and where the APIs are fairly consistent. They have existed for years and not been changed. The primary application that PalDev has released is called Pals, which is, to this day, the greatest success story of data reuse on Urbit, where there is just a common trusted source of truth on some data that different organizations can call back to, and by that basis interoperate with each other. In this case, we're talking about a friends list or a list of trusted peers. And they don't need to know anything about each other. They only need to know something about what their application has knowledge of, which is this primitive. And so we're trying to learn by PalDev's example and develop other things where there is a need for, a desire for interoperability along some primitive, and try to replicate in these other examples the success of PalDev and PALS and some other applications developed by PalDev. PALS is really the main one that I think has clearly been a smashing success. And in our last segment, Ryan, you brought up chat and how it would be nice if there was a final chat application. And to me, I actually don't think that should be on the radar. I think one of the other things that's been shown by the developments in the ecosystem over the last year is that chat is really not a very primitive thing. It can always get much better. You can add things like read receipts, client-side encryption, optimistic rendering, a lot of aspects of the application logic that really do call for revisiting the design of the program as time goes on. And we do have example chat applications in the Urbit tutorials that are very few lines of code and that developers can replicate within a matter of hours. But they really are a long way away from what people tend to expect from chat applications in this day and age. Chat applications outside of Urbit are quite mature. They have a lot of features, and they go well beyond just the exchange of instant text messages.
Yeah, I agree with that. Chat may not be the best example of a protocol that is simple because, like you said, we've seen a lot of creativity and addition of features to chat. There are many apps that we use today that have what's common among them is the transmission of some text string, but then there's all kinds of coloring around it. Other ways to you could send. Well, I mean, sending a link is still text string, but I think perhaps a better example of a protocol that would be difficult to simplify further, one that I haven't thought about for several months now, but I'll bring it up, was a payments protocol. I mean, I suppose this one can get into the weeds as too, but establishing a standard for the way that value is transmitted could be simpler than chat. Perhaps I would have to think about this. But I mean, what is sending a payment? It's a number, it's a sender, a recipient, and an asset, some symbol that represents what that asset is. And that a lot of features can be added to that as well. So it could be that we just end up with a plurality of protocols. I mean, Urbit is a great substrate for the development of protocols. And maybe we're going to end up in a future where you just have almost as many protocols as we have chat apps today in the Web 2 era. We have Messenger, we have Signal, we have all the others. And I think the recyclability value add still holds, because while we might not have this utopia of just there's the one final chat protocol, at least developers will be able to develop on top of those protocols because they will be permissionless. They won't have to get permission from Facebook or Telegram or whatever, or be constrained by whatever APIs those private companies offer. So I think a potential scenario that we'll find ourselves in years down the road is one in which that looks kind of similar to the one that we have today in terms of the variety, but the developer freedom would be could be far greater.
Talking about the proliferation of protocols, and in what context? What do you mean by recyclability in that context?
Well, I'm a hobbyist developer and I'm making a game and my game needs a chat. Well, I know because we're 10 years into the future and Urbit has 100 million users that 99% of ships have the basic chat protocol installed by default. And it doesn't give you any emojis. It doesn't give you reactions, or well, maybe it gives you emojis, but like, it's just super basic. And I, as the hobbyist developer, can just throw that in right away, and I can get back to the interesting game design problems. And later, when my game hits it big, I can start expanding its capabilities. Maybe I can investigate some of the more feature-rich chat protocols that others have come up with. But just as like a placeholder, I can just quickly throw together this kind of boilerplate to get a functioning peer-to-peer application. And that's kind of that's the direction in which I'm thinking, is that
a primitive chat protocol would be nice. It would be good to have a primitive chat protocol if such a thing could be accomplished, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it'd be a capital good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the reason I said that it wasn't really on the table is just because it's quite difficult. There's other things that are not so difficult that could be tackled first. So at Assembly 2022, Talon gave this really impressive presentation that to me, it was the biggest takeaway from the event, was what Talon was presenting and the vision they were presenting, which had everything to do with this idea of digital basics. And I think it was that. They wanted a primitive chat protocol, a primitive micro or macro blogging long form protocol, and a couple of other things to do with galleries of content, and saying these were the primitive elements of the social network. And I think at the time they had every intention of supporting a third-party ecosystem of developers who would depend on those. I think today they view that idea as kind of a liability. And I do tend to trust them when they say that, yeah, it turns out that making chat a digital basic is kind of in conflict with the need to make a competitive product. Like, I think the way they're looking at it is like they view Telegram as competition. They view Signal as competition, right? How do you get to Telegram or Signal level of UI, which these are UI miracles, especially Telegram is just, there are very few apps that feel as intuitive as that. And they do require, significant complexity on the back end to reach that state. And yeah, they have at this point been, I think, fairly explicit about not seeking to be treated as a primitive. Talon's product is a thing unto itself. If there are primitives, then I think Talon is open to the idea of using them. I agree that a chat primitive would be nice. If you look at the two chat protocols that first evolved out of this, it was Pongo and Groups. And they actually had radically different backends. There was a database architecture on this Uqbar project called Pongo. And that was, Uqbar was actually, I think, very interested in this problem of user space primitives. And they viewed this database backend as possibly this is the P such that A and B are comfortable calling it. And that was a reason why they wanted to go off in their own direction. But yeah, it's quite hard. And one of the areas where I think it would have been nice to have primitives is a much easier case, which is in just declaring a group of Urbit IDs as a thing. When Halium began developing Urbit applications, they first made this app called Ballot, which interoperated with Talon groups, and it gave groups of Urbits this ability to create polls and then vote on those polls with real signatures and have a verifiable outcome of a poll that told you what people in the group preferred. And later on in the history of this ecosystem, once again, we saw this kind of failure of interoperability along the lines of communication breakdowns between organizations. And where Holium used to think about their notion of spaces as extending Talon's notion of groups, which both fundamentally deal with a set of PAT-P, a set of Urbit ID, Holium ended up believing that it was not worth it to try to call Talon's application in order to have an understanding of a group of people. They needed their own. And so it didn't have to turn out like that. What could have happened instead was that there was a common primitive understanding of what is the essence of a group of Urbit IDs. I think it more or less looks like a simple access control list with a single owner. And a space and a group could have been merely an extension of that context. And you could easily have users share an experience of, within the context of a Holium application, using realm features, and then in the context of a Talon application, using landscape features, without needing to rethink the notion of who was in what group. And that is, I think, a much easier target. And that is something that I hope, I don't want to make too many promises on air, but that is something that I hope that my team and the Urbit Labs team together can come up with a real answer to. A real answer that is low maintenance, that is truly primitive, that is open, that is agreeable, ecumenical, non-opinionated. That in the future, app developers can achieve interoperability on that basis.
Another thought that comes to my mind is an article that was posted by Ben Hodzod a while ago now. If I can recall the main point of this article, it was that we're just too early to be investing effort in coordinating the establishment of standards between all these different organizations. And we're better off just all going in our own direction and allowing those standards to emerge in the kind of bizarre style. And at the time I read that, it made a lot of sense. It seemed to be somewhat of a consensus opinion. And yeah, that's what I have to add on this topic.
Yeah, I think he had a point. It's not exactly contradictory to the idea of shared primitives. One thing is, going back to the beginnings of interoperability, there's a difference between code reuse and data reuse. And code reuse doesn't have the same problems as data reuse. So normally in an ecosystem, when you think about primitives, you're thinking about like libraries that can be mutually shared. And there's not a serious negative consequence to just choosing not to use the same library as somebody else. But from a product perspective, when you're offering something to users, you really don't want to confuse them with two different notions of the same thing. Actually, that is one of the main reasons why I believe, and I don't think I'm alone in this at all, that Urbit is very promising for developing social media products, is because the competition to Urbit, which is the whole entire rest of the world, has that confusion, where people don't really like using different applications for chat. And they would like to just have one notion of chat that has everything included. Maybe there's other applications that can also chat in a different way. And that's useful, for example, for more private communities that that see an advantage to being obscure to the rest of the world. But for the most part, people do seek unification. And it's quite funny because Urbit was sold this way. In the very early days of our application ecosystem, after the ability to create applications was first released, the complaint was that, oh my God, there's so many chat apps. Which one do I use to contact you? Isn't this a silly problem? And then one day we had that problem on Urbit. And that, to me, that was a big moral defeat. And so from a product perspective, if I'm a hosting provider, I would like to be able to say, without trying to, interject on the freedom of developers or users, but I would like to be able to say that within this product that you can sign up for, within this context, you don't have to worry about that confusion, that there is unification over these primitives. It's a desirable outcome. But I think Ben made a good point that if you want to build something and somebody else is already building it, you shouldn't wait for them to finish, especially if you have a good idea, because they might fail and they might also just not be as good.
Shout out to our highly competent audio producer and engineer, Dean, who goes by No More Poetry on Spotify. It's been very helpful throughout this process.
So for all of Urbit's history, leading up to today, and still including today, with the exception maybe of Equity and some companies that have started up on Urbit in the last couple of years, the primary way that people can gain financial exposure to the Urbit ecosystem is through this somewhat difficult to explain concept to newbies we normally refer to as address space. I actually like to call it Urbit ID. I think Urbit ID is just a very nice term that encompasses a lot of different things. And I like to refer to investing in Urbit ID. But we can use the common lingo and talk about address space. The address space market peaked a couple of years ago, and it has been going down for quite a while now. One might say that the address space market, from a graph perspective, if you pull up the chart of how stars, which are the go-to investment vehicle for address space, are priced, it does not paint an optimistic picture. You see an asset that peaked, I think, at around $30,000 per, from my memory, in late 2021, maybe mid 2021. We'll put a graph in the show notes and viewers can see what we're referring to. Today, a single star, I think, is steadily hovering around $2,000. And there really have not been a lot of volatile shifts in the value of address space you would normally see in crypto markets. There was a time even that the reason people would posit for why Urbit address space was not doing so well was because the crypto markets generally were not doing very well. That's definitely not true today. The crypto market is doing really well as of this recording, and the address space market is not. And this is an area where everybody has a theory about what's going on. I think the obvious takeaway for a naive investor is that this asset is simply not worth that much. And that's not what I believe. I believe the asset is incredibly valuable. I continue to be in the market for address space. I recently purchased some, full disclosure. So maybe we want to make a bags disclosure for the podcast. Both Ryan and I are address space investors, but we're investors not because we believe we can shift the course of the market through the production of a great podcast. We do both have beliefs about the capabilities of this asset, but I think this is just a topic that really deserves to be cracked open. The value of Urbit address space and the tokenomics of the asset, trying to explain the history of the asset's price, current strategies for improving the market value of address space, and whether those strategies are good or bad, for what reasons. And Ryan is a successful crypto investor. You have notably made some successes in analyzing the value of cryptographic assets and making bets on them before they go up in value. Also, a fair degree, I assume, of closing your positions before they go down. Very important in this market. And so I'd like to hear from you on how you see the address space market. First of all, I guess, are you discouraged by recent performance? And what is your explanation for the price movement?
I am not discouraged. No, I am not discouraged. And I think the explanation is pretty simple. I think that we have yet to solve the kind of problem that excites or ignites the imaginations of investors. I think we have yet to deliver a application that that solves real problems. And I think that when we do, the tides will turn. It might take some time, but I I remain optimistic. I'm not. I mean, I've made some successful investments, but really, I see myself more as a trader, or at least I look back on the whatever success I've had. It's mostly been the consequence of good trading.
To clarify, the use of the term trading here as opposed to investment is to say that you were sometimes playing with assets that maybe you didn't have fundamental beliefs about, but saw movements occurring.
Yes, I've purchased and sold three-letter tickers that I did not know what they were at all, and was trading purely on a quantitative basis. Really hadn't had the slightest clue what it is I was buying and selling. So yeah, I really the term that's probably most appropriate is a quant. Like I do a lot of quantitative research, and I implement algorithms that exploit quantitative inefficiencies. Um, that's kind of my expertise. So, the explanation or the viewpoint that I have on address space as an asset, as an investable asset, I'm not sure I have any particularly like unique insight into its failure to uh, catch a ride along with all of the other interests that crypto, the resurgence in interest that crypto uh, has had recently. Um, I think we just my viewpoint's pretty simple. I think that the Urbit core the kernel is not quite ready to support the applications that are going to be required to drive adoption and drive a speculative interest and investment.
And what would that look like? We in the unstoppable software discussion, we looked at a Bitcoin example, which obviously is going to be the primordial example of a digital asset that spikes speculative interest. But what concretely do you think investors are looking for that address space has not yet delivered, other than price action?
I think they, well, like I'm the kind of investor that I don't really wait. I'm like I think I'm like one of the more very early kind of investors where like I'm not waiting for some kind of confirmation from the market. I'm just trying to evaluate things with my own model. And even if the asset looks completely dead from a financial standpoint, if I reason my way to a conclusion that this is, the logic leads me to, some future scenario that I think is probable, that's kind of the way that I approach investing. Um, but for the people that want a bit more of a confirmation, or maybe the confirmation is just kind of part and parcel of getting their attention, um, because you kind of have to find this thing, you have to have some awareness of it. I think that like two possibilities come to mind. One, I think, is the creation of applications that solve problems for people that are in censored environments, whether that's social or it's I mean, I just say drugs as like a kind of a general term for like
It's a great example.
nefarious yeah, it is. I mean, there's lots of money in it, and um I look at say Farcaster as being one of the few attempts to create peer-to-peer social media that has received substantial traction. I think as of this recording, they've had approximately 200,000 signups. And that is just, to my knowledge, they are the leader in terms of actual adoption and usage.
Does that reflect in the price of some asset that represents Farcaster?
Yeah, I don't think so exactly. I think there was some kind of shitcoin type asset that wasn't directly related to the project, but was maybe a community effort or something that got some action. But no, I think they're kind of just a pure protocol, pure open source endeavor. Um, but they've gotten and Noster, right? They've gotten a fair amount of usage as well. And I don't think that I I also haven't used any of these personally, so I'm commenting as an outsider. But my sense is that the people that are interested in using these protocols are not seeking them out because, they were, their Twitter account was shut down or their YouTube account was shut down or something. Like, I don't even think these platforms are capable really um,
Of supporting those use cases?
yeah, not exactly. I mean, like as a broadcast arena, if you have some video that's like, you're still gonna have to get your video hosted elsewhere if it's some, podcast or something. But you might be able to link to it. So, those are examples of projects that have gotten traction that our system is capable of replicating, and they're not breaking laws in the process. They've just kind of captured the imagination of I think more so the more ideologically motivated people that are involved in crypto, and captured the imagination of developers who are just looking for a way to permissionlessly innovate. So they've gotten traction. I think the drugs thing is kind of it's a possibility. And frankly, beyond that, like I'm not really sure what the others could be at this important to highlight at this point of our development. Um, because what takes you from, a few hundred users to tens of thousands to hundreds to millions uh, are different.
I think something that comes up often in discussions about the value of Urbit address space, the valuation, I should say, of Urbit address space, that that people look to as maybe a pain point that could be remedied by just good software engineering, is the legibility and fungibility of the asset. So can somebody looking to make a bet on Urbit quickly get themselves up to speed on how address space is expected to give them a return on their investment, and then can they then take that knowledge to the logical conclusion of making a purchase, on a platform that would support that purchase, in an amount of money that they choose. So specifically what that means is you need to understand the rundown of, okay, here are the galaxies, here are the stars, here are the planets. You also have moons and comets, and the relationship to each other is simple in some ways, complicated in others. The way that this structure captures value on behalf of stars and galaxies in particular is also difficult to understand, not always perceived as perfectly clear, even by audiences that understand it. And then where that takes you is the possibility of buying an NFT, typically sold on OpenSea.com. There's also UrbitX.com, which is a OpenSea-like marketplace specifically for Urbit address space, and there are others, which is a non-fungible transaction. You must buy a particular star or galaxy in some cases, and you must purchase in a transaction amount that is a multiple of the price of stars at that time. Your alternative to that is this asset called Wrapped Star. The ticker is Worcester, WSTR. And this is a smart contract that very simply reduces a star of certain qualities that guarantee that it has not been used for anything that might reduce its value into a fungible token that can be divided into pieces. And this contract, as I've been made aware, has some issues with this thing in automated market makers known as liquidity. And so critiques have been made about, first the base case without wrapped star, how legible is this and how accessible is this value prop? And then does wrapped star actually address that issue? Is it failing to do so because of the lack of liquidity in the pool? Or does it fail to address that for other issues? Is WSTR just a bad way to say Urbit? Should it maybe just say, $URBIT to say that you're investing in Urbit? And yeah, without going straight into my own opinion, that's the landscape as I see it. And I'd be interested to know where you see yourself in that landscape.
Okay, so address space has a few issues today. There is a lack of liquidity in the Wrapstar pool. We have Wrapstar, which is not ideal. We are not listed on a popular exchange that has a high degree of visibility and that can be proximal to large amounts of liquidity in the crypto ecosystem. The story is a bit of an issue. It never really bothered me. Like when I was appraising address space as an investment in the beginning, I didn't believe I needed to form any kind of strong opinion around any kind of strong opinion of its story. I kept it very simple in my mind. I said, okay, these things are like IP addresses. They are the essential financialized asset for this system. And so value accrual will occur. They will capture value.
Under what conditions? If the system grows, if it shows action along daily active users?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the supply demand mechanic, I don't think needs to really drive speculative interest. I don't think like 1 star is more than enough to satisfy all of the present day users and could for some time. So it's really going to be more so a forward-looking decision being made by these investors. And it's not that they're, I think, even projecting that, years from now, we're going to get to a point where there will be like a genuine kind of scarcity for IDs and it gets harder to acquire one. I think they'll always be quite easy to acquire for like many, many, many years into the future. Like how long, maybe not the fairest comparison, but like how long did it take before conversations around IPv6 started to become more crucial?
Right.
Probably like decades into the internet's evolution. So yeah, I don't think I think when people think in terms of supply demand, I don't think it's actually that important. It is in some fundamental sense, but I don't think the investors ascribe as much importance to it as some others might.
But you said the ticker's unfortunate. You think that's a big factor?
I think it's a minor factor. It's a symptom of a larger communication problem that we have, an education problem.
Maybe a legibility problem?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a consensus view that seems to be developing that, God, I wish I could just be grug-brained and invest in the Urbit token. Why isn't there just an Urbit token that's like, 1 Urbit token, or the smallest unit of it is arbitrarily, cheap, and I could just buy as many of them as I want and then close my position when I want to if I'm making a short-term investment. Why isn't there that? And I think, the kind of quantitative investment, opportunities I think there's actually a will to appeal to that crowd, right? People should be able to just make short-term investments in address space based on short-term price action, and that's currently not possible.
Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, being able to trade an asset raises its awareness. Like I think it is quite true that narratives follow speculation and price appreciation. Like people come up with this stories post hoc when they come up with their narratives and explanations post hoc when they see some shitcoin, go up 100% in a week or something like that. They start to create the explanation, and it may map to reality uh, to some degree, but the narratives kind of emerge like in reverse as well. I mean, like, stars are kind of circling the drain at the moment. And so the narratives that emerge are what, like this, this is never going to work. It's too, it's an art project. These are the critiques that emerge. And, if a few $1 million showed up next week and swept the floor, and we're looking at a much higher valuation, suddenly people are going to say, "Oh, the smart money's here," and they are going to come up with explanations for why this is going to work.
So legibility really comes first, and legibility and accessibility.
Yeah, and we are not accessible. I mean, relatively, because if you want exposure today, you are going to go to OpenSea. That is basically the place to go. Or you're going to maybe send a DM to somebody at the Urban Foundation and try and, if you're a large VC firm, perhaps you could try to obtain a Galaxy. But
kind of implicit KYC.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and NFTs are just they have valuable technical properties, but they are pretty shitty financial instruments. Because if you like today, I think if a star is going for half an ETH on on OpenSea today, you're going to pay something like 4% of its value in gas fees just to purchase it. And that's untenable. Like that's that's untenable from a trading standpoint. There's no chance you're going to make any kind of short-term trade on that with that kind of transaction fee. You can make a long-term investment, but there will not be any trading activity. Um, and 4% per star. Like this needs to be wrapped into some kind of fungible token, because if I want to buy 100 stars, the gas fee for that should be like $10 or 20 or whatever, it costs. Gas fees are quite high today, but um it's just too inefficient.
Do you maybe envision a world where most address space is wrapped into some kind of fungible asset for the foreseeable future?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't know. I would have to think about this more deeply, but like I wonder whether there was a way we could have architected Azimuth. I wasn't around back then, but like could it have been architected in such a way that everything began as an ERC20 and then was, unwrapped or somehow translated into an NFT version, but the system was instantiated as an ERC20, because I think it is likely that the vast majority of address space will be treated as a financial asset for perhaps decades. Because it won't be until we actually have, say, like 1 billion users that a substantial portion of the address space will be in use and will no longer be a financial asset. So we're kind of in this position now where whatever amount needs to be financialized and traded and be made efficient for investors, it needs to go through this costly conversion process. And yeah, it's not ideal. I mean, that's where we are, but
talking to you and some of the other, more crypto native participants in the address space market about this problem, it often brings to my mind this vision of, or this metaphor, this analogy of electricity and markets and capital being, markets are these conductive elements, and capital is kind of this energy that's being conducted, and what you want is like a high voltage connection to existing markets that have capital within them for the possibility of capital just flowing along that connection into your market. So there are two ways to treat investment of assets like these, maybe more than two. The two that I'm aware of are fundamental and technical analysis. And so I feel my takeaway from your pitch here, which I'm actually fairly aligned with, is address space doesn't have a fundamental analysis problem. It has problems that have more to do with the technical side of things. There are accidental properties of address space that are holding it back.
Like also, like being an NFT, we are like one of the advantages of launching on Ethereum is that we get to we get to interface with all of the infrastructure. We MetaMask, OpenSea, probably other stuff too. And one of the downsides of being an NFT is that we also can't easily interface with the exchanges where all of the trading activity occurs and investing activity. It's where the capital lives, right? And some exchanges have support for NFT marketplaces, but like most of it, I think most of the volume still takes place on OpenSea. And being an ERC20 would just give us the ability to have a very smooth integration into these homes of capital.
Yeah, that's a very good insight. Well, we're coming to time. This has been a really great first episode. I'm very happy with this format of radio show podcast. Once again, shout out to No More Poetry on Spotify, our audio engineer, Dean.
Yeah.
So I suppose we should wrap up and say goodbye to our audience. We're going to record these ideally once every couple weeks, talk about the latest stuff going on in the Urbit ecosystem. If you have any ideas for topics that you'd like us to touch on, you can at us at Urbit Radio on Twitter. You can also reach out to tiller-tolbus is my Urbit ID. You can also reach out to master-malwyl.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time.
Alrighty, guys. I'll see you next time.